Welcome, everyone. Today, we are going to talk a little bit about my growing up with Depression era parents, some of the foods that we ate, the way our household was ran, and some of the tips that we can gain from that time frame to be able to save money today, because many of those still work. I hope you will stick around. Hi, I'm Bonita and I am early retired. I'm not old enough yet for Social Security. I'm living on a low income and I am living off of savings. I live in Kansas on a farm and I have a donkey. This is Brownie. I have frugal videos all year round, and I hope that you will join me this year as we share ways to save money and live our dreams. I was born in 1966, and even though I was the youngest of 4 children, I was still raised very much like my parents were raised in the Depression era. And it was very old-fashioned, and if I look back on it now, things were so much different than they are today. For instance, when I went to school and rode the bus, if it snowed, right after lunch, they would send all the bus kids home, but the town kids had to stay in school the whole day. And they could count it as a whole day if we stayed after lunch. So no matter how bad the weather was, we still went to school, but we could leave after lunch. And we just prayed all day long that the roads weren't too bad to get us home. Also, town kids were allowed to walk home for lunch and back to school in time for their next class. None of those things are done today. So things were much different. But growing up, there was a pretty standard way of living in our household, and that never changed from my oldest brother being born in 1951 and me being born in 1966. So the World War II era really influenced my parents and my grandparents, as well as the Depression. People saved money and were so careful with what they purchased. They didn't have a large income, things were rationed. And so self sufficiency was super important to them back then. And the less they could buy from the grocery stores, the better. There were roughly 4 concepts looking back that we used to save money around our house, and those 4 can still be used today. The first one was a rotating meal plan, and it was a 7-day meal plan. We knew what we were having every night of the week based on what day it was. My favorite day was Sunday. It was always fried chicken, homemade hot rolls, homemade scallop potatoes, and a vegetable that might vary. That was always the same every single week. People didn't get tired of them. There was 7 meals. Things were very basic and simple back then. We weren't trying to think up new recipes, look up new recipes. We were sticking to the basics. There was a lot of hard work going on behind the scenes. We were running a farm, we were taking care of animals. So food was not looked at as entertainment. Food was not a go-to when you were stressed, when you had anxiety, when you were bored, when you just wanted to watch TV and snack. Things were not looked at it like that back then. Food was looked at as fuel. You ate your 3 meals a day. You ate a hearty meal that carried you to the next meal, and the kitchen wasn't considered a room that was on limits 24 hours a day. It was a room that was looked at as a room that you used when you were getting ready to prepare food, and then the rest of the time, your day was filled. The second concept was we grew our own as much as possible. My grandpa lived down the road from us. He grew potatoes. He would bring them in 5-gallon buckets. Potatoes, potatoes, potatoes. So we didn't have to grow our own potatoes. Grandpa was really good at it, and they were so delicious. And now that I'm older, I realize how much work went into that. And he was in his late 60s and 70s, but he provided all of our potatoes. We always had a large garden that Dad grew every single year, and that supplemented us. And Mom also canned a lot of that into the winter and put it in our pantry. We also had our own farm animals, so we didn't do a lot of grocery shopping. So the third concept is there was limited grocery shopping in our house. We did as much as we could on our own to make food stretch and to raise everything we could on our own. And then the fourth concept is there was a lot of homemade items, homemade clothes, homemade food. We didn't buy a lot at the grocery store at all, and we kept our expenses low. I remember my dad wanted to keep his electric bill around $26 to $29 a month. Back then, we didn't even have a microwave. We didn't have all of those kitchen gadgets. There was very little plugged in back then. So those are the four concepts that I had growing up, and I used those in raising my own kids. I was not a sewer as far as homemade clothes go, so I would have to shop clearance, garage sales, get hand-me-downs from friends and neighbors, and we would swap clothes. But I did really try to keep my utilities low and to keep my food costs low. So I'm going to share with you 10 of the favorite foods that we had growing up during the Depression era, what they have kind of changed into now that is more expensive, and how if we would go back to some of those ideas, we could save some money on our monthly bills. One of the menus that I fed my kids when they were growing up, and this was for meals, this was for supper, not for breakfast. It was biscuits and gravy. Now, you can still get biscuits and gravy if you go out to eat, but how many people still make it at home as a meal? And we would have it for supper, and the kids really enjoyed it. They had their choice of having the biscuits with the jelly or the biscuits with the gravy. Once in a while, we would have meat with it, but not super often. And I had this growing up, only we didn't have biscuits. We had bacon, toast, and gravy. Our gravy was on toast. And I had that just this morning for breakfast, toast and gravy. It is really good. You don't always have to have a biscuit, and you don't even have to have bacon. But when we did have bacon growing up with it, we would break up the bacon into little pieces on top of the gravy, and that was a staple in our house. We had it several days a week for breakfast. Bacon, toast, and gravy. So if we would go back to some biscuit and gravy meals for supper, we could save some money. This was a variation of the Depression era meal where you made hard-boiled eggs and then you peeled them and diced them up and put them in your gravy and put them over toast. I still love that. I still make that and eat that myself. Sometimes I make it for lunch when I'm here by myself. Hard-boiled egg, diced up in gravy, over toast. It may not sound that good, but let me tell you, it is to die for. Some of these old Depression era foods were really, really good. And at first glance, they may not sound that good until you try them. And then you wonder how they ever thought of coming up with some of this stuff because it is so delicious. Now, the second one was beans on bread. I've mentioned this in a couple of videos, how I grew up eating Great Northern beans on buttered bread. And then I would eat that. The bread was in the place of the cornbread. Now, sometimes we did have Great Northern beans with cornbread for supper growing up. That was one of the meals that we had every single week. And if we didn't want beans, we could have cornbread with syrup on top, and we ate it kind of like cornbread mush, or we ate it kind of like it was a pancake or a waffle, but it was cornbread with butter and syrup. So if we didn't want the beans, we had that option. Both of those are really, really good. That's some of the things I ate as a teenager growing up was beans on bread, and I still do it today. The third thing was the fried chicken I talked about. We had whole fried chicken. My mom could cut up a chicken and nothing flat into all of the pieces. We salted and floured and fried the chicken. That's all that went on it, salt and flour. That is still how I make my chicken today. We have gotten used to buying the pieces of meat that we like, and that makes it more expensive than buying the whole chicken. We've gotten used to just buying the breasts or just buying the legs and just making those. And a lot of times people don't even take the time to fry chicken anymore. And it's surprising how that's kind of turned into a lost art unless you go out to eat again and order fried chicken. But we had fried chicken and it was very, very normal. In fact, our first day of vacation, every single year in the camper, mom would fry chicken and we would eat it for our first and second meal out on the road, and we would eat it cold. Not cold pizza, cold chicken. And if you've ever tried cold chicken, it is delicious. Remember, I grew up with no microwave. So once you ate it the first time and it was hot, any leftovers were always served cold. And also nowadays, people have started buying those chicken strips that are pre-breaded. There are so few of those in a bag. They are so very expensive. And I don't know about you, but I don't think the quality of them is as good as real chicken. Hard-boiled eggs. Remember, I grew up on a farm, so we had eggs, we had gardening, we had things that we were self-sufficient with. We would hard boil eggs and they were made into egg salad sandwiches. They were put into potato salad. They were used in a lot of foods to add extra protein and to stretch your food a little bit farther and to get those eggs used up that we had on the farm. The fifth one was I grew up with watered down chili, is what you would call it today. When we had chili, we added water where it was a soup. It was not thick like it is today. We only had crackers. There was never any Fritos. And that's how we ate our chili. You had crackers floating on your chili broth. And if you've never tried it that way, it's very delicious. It makes your chili go farther, and that may be why we had it back then. Nowadays, we expect chili to be thick, to hang on that spoon, and to have the Fritos and the cheese and the sour cream and the onions and all these toppings. We had it very basic back then. Our chili was a soup. And when my kids were older and I made chili and I started making it thicker, I would take leftovers that wasn't enough to feed a whole family. I would layer it in a pan and I would make either some biscuits to sit on top, or I would make like sloppy Joe meat on the bottom and some biscuits to set on top and make that stretch into a casserole. That is very delicious as well. So if you don't have enough left to have enough bowls of that for everyone, try adding some biscuits to the top and make that meal stretch. Another option you can use that is very inexpensive is mixing up some cornbread mix and pouring that over the top and baking it and making it into a casserole. That is also super delicious. The next one was taco burgers. We didn't grow up with having tacos in the house or taco salad or enchiladas or any of those things. We had taco burgers. They were very popular back then. You could even get those if you went out to eat at a taco shop. But we would make taco meat and put it on a burger, and we would have that without all of the toppings. No lettuce, no tomato, no taco sauce. We didn't have that. But if you've never tried a taco burger, I encourage you to try them. They may be your new favorite. The next thing we had was ice milk. Back then, ice milk was sold instead of ice cream. It was cheaper. It was made out of milk and not cream. It cost very, very little. Or we had ice cream bars once in a while. And of course, we made homemade ice cream. I still make homemade ice cream. We rarely ever buy any in the store. I feel like I can make it tasting better at home and use less ingredients and fit it in my freezer as the space allows without spending any gas money or time to go buy ice cream. Ice cream has gotten so expensive, and back then, they also had these really cheap little cream pies. I don't know if you remember them. They were not very big. You could cut the slices into very small pieces, and they usually sold for like 99 cents, and you could get 6 pieces out of this cheap cream pie. But those are some of the things that we had that were not the most expensive. And they've kind of gone away with selling ice milk. I think once they started selling the ice cream and it was more popular and more expensive, they just quit making the ice milk. I noticed that in trends as we're shopping. Sometimes things that were less expensive just go away because they figured out a way to make it a little more expensive, and they just eliminate that choice so that you have to buy that choice. But we always have the choice of making things homemade. The next one was we had a lot of fruits and vegetables that we grew. We had apples on trees, we had pears on trees, we had tomatoes, we had carrots, we had radishes. But one of the things that might surprise you is we didn't have salad dressing in our house. Around the holidays, we would have the wilted lettuce salad that is made with vinegar. That is in my first cookbook. But other than that, we never had salad dressing. We ate our lettuce with salt. Now, you're probably saying that is horrible. Don't knock it till you've tried it. Lettuce with salt is really good. And the other day I thought about it and I thought, man, I'm really craving some lettuce with salt. So, yes, some of these old-fashioned ways are really delicious. And do you know how many calories are in that salad dressing and how much fat? I think we were much healthier back then, just adding a small layer of salt. And then also, we had limited ingredients, as I was alluding to in the last comment about the salt. We had no garlic. We didn't have um, any of these special, I mean, the spice section in the store is so huge. We didn't have all of that back then. We had very basic stuff like salt and pepper. We had some nutmeg. We had cinnamon. Um, we didn't have all of these spices, and they do really add up to a lot of money. But there was no Italian seasoning. We didn't have basil. We didn't have oregano. We didn't have any of these things in our house. And yet we ate delicious meals because we cooked with basic foods and basic spices. We also ate basic cuts of meat, nothing extravagant. I never saw a steak in my house growing up. We never had a roast. Everything was ground hamburger because, again, we were farmers. We had ground hamburger, we had bacon, and we had chicken. That was the meats I grew up with, unless my dad was able to bring home something else from being out gaming. That is all we had. So we grew up very basic, and I survived and I turned out okay. And my kids were raised on only hamburger and chicken. That was the only two things we had in our house because they were the cheapest back then. They're no longer the cheapest. So we've had to adapt now to ground pork and pork roasts, and we still do buy bacon when it's on sale. I have very little hamburger in there. We don't even care for it anymore. And chicken is a treat because chicken is so expensive. So we have to adapt along the way to what it allows. Of course, we still have our own small garden. It does supplement a little bit and it's fun. It doesn't cover like all of our potatoes for the whole summer and winter, like my grandpa did. But we are able to do some things to supplement our budgets. And if we stick to some of those concepts and maybe even add in a few of those old fashioned meals here and there, we will see a drop in our monthly expenses at the grocery store. I hope this video has been fun for you to listen to maybe take a trip down memory lane and see what it was like back then growing up in rural Kansas. And I hope that you enjoyed it so much so that you'll come back again. I hope to see you soon.